Black CEO humiliated by airline staff. One phone call later, he cancels a $1 billion contract. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now, back to Marcus Ellison. Marcus Ellison stood just beyond the stanchion at gate C-17 as the boarding area filled with the low hum of rolling carry-ons and morning announcements echoing through the terminal. The digital clock above the counter blinking 7:42 a.m., right on schedule for a non-stop flight from Chicago to San Francisco. He wore a charcoal hoodie, dark jeans, and clean sneakers. Nothing flashy, nothing that signaled status, just a man traveling alone with a slim laptop bag over his shoulder. His boarding pass showed Group 1, Seat 2A, First Class, paid in full weeks earlier, yet the moment he stepped forward, the temperature shifted. Rebecca Holt, the lead flight attendant, glanced at the pass and then at Marcus, her eyes narrowing just enough to register doubt. She didn't scan it. She didn't smile. She tilted her head and said there must be a mistake, her voice carrying the practiced confidence of someone used to being obeyed. Marcus replied calmly that there wasn't, that he flew this route often, that everything was in order. Rebecca waved a hand toward the waiting area and said he should step aside until they resolved it, even as two white passengers behind him were waved through without a second look. A few heads turned. A man near the window slowed his walk. A woman seated nearby watched over the rim of her coffee cup. Marcus felt the familiar pressure settle in his chest. Not panic, not anger, but recognition. He had felt this before, years earlier, when credentials weren't enough and explanations were treated like excuses. Daniel Wright, the gate supervisor, joined them, crisp uniform, clipped tone, asking Marcus to present additional ID. Marcus complied, handing over his driver's license, keeping his posture relaxed, his voice even. Daniel studied the card longer than necessary, then asked where Marcus was headed and why. He was traveling alone, questions that drifted past policy and into presumption. Rebecca added that first class was limited and reserved for priority clients, the implication hanging in the air like a verdict. Marcus did not raise his voice. He did not demand a manager. He simply repeated that his seat was assigned and valid. The line behind him stalled. Boarding announcements paused. Someone sighed audibly. Daniel suggested that Marcus wait while they verified the record, stepping in front of him as if to block the path forward. The humiliation wasn't loud. It was procedural, wrapped in smiles and rules, delivered in public where dignity erodes by the second. A young attendant glanced at the screen and hesitated, then looked away when Rebecca cleared her throat. Marcus noticed the small gestures, the quiet compliance, the way authority can turn uncertainty into certainty if no one challenges it. He shifted his bag from one shoulder to the other and looked toward the jet bridge, imagining the narrow aisle, the seat by the window, the simple act of sitting down becoming a negotiation. The clock ticked to 7:45 a.m. Daniel said they might need to reassign the seat if verification took too long. Rebecca nodded, already reaching for the keyboard. Marcus felt the weight of eyes on him, the unspoken question of whether he belonged. He breathed in, steady and controlled, and decided that explanations would not change the outcome, but clarity would. He reached into his pocket, not for another document, not for proof, but for his phone, and in that quiet moment, as the terminal noise swelled and the gate lights flickered, the balance of power began to move. Marcus Ellison remained standing near the edge of the boarding area as the gate activity resumed around him, the subtle choreography of travel continuing as if nothing unusual were happening. Yet for him, the moment stretched, thick with memory and restraint. He watched passengers shuffle forward, heard the soft beep of boarding passes scanning, smelled the faint mix of coffee and recycled air, and felt the familiar calculation settle in his mind, the one that always appeared when he chose silence over spectacle. He had learned early that volume did not equal authority, that composure often unsettled people more than confrontation ever could. Marcus had not dressed down by accident that morning. He had done it the same way he always did when he traveled without his executive team, when he wanted to observe rather than announce himself, to see how systems treated people when titles were invisible. His hoodie was comfortable, his sneakers practical, his watch understated, and nothing about him demanded attention, yet everything about him was intentional. Years earlier, when his company was still a modest operation and his name carried no weight in boardrooms, he had stood in lines like this one and learned how quickly respect could evaporate when assumptions took control. That education had not hardened him, but it had sharpened him. He understood that the discomfort unfolding at Gate C-17 was not about a seat or a boarding group, but about who was expected to belong in certain spaces without question. Marcus glanced toward the gate counter again, where Rebecca Holt spoke quietly with Daniel Wright, their heads close together, their expressions tight with procedural certainty. They did not look at him. They did not ask him anything new. They acted as if the pause itself would pressure him into compliance. He noticed how easily the crowd accepted the delay, how quickly eyes drifted away once the moment no longer promised entertainment. That, too, was familiar. Marcus shifted his weight slightly and checked the time on his phone, not out of impatience, but to mark the moment. He believed in keeping records, mental and otherwise. He thought about the meeting waiting for him in San Francisco, the long table, the polished glass, the executives who would speak about partnerships and growth without knowing that one of their largest relationships was being tested in a place as ordinary as an airport gate. He thought about the contract his company held with this airline, a sprawling agreement that stretched across multiple fiscal years, negotiated by teams who never had to wonder if their boarding pass would be questioned. None of that showed on his face. To the casual observer, Marcus Ellison was just another traveler caught in an inconvenience, a man standing quietly while authority deliberated. That perception was part of the reason he stayed still. Silence, he knew, had a way of revealing who was comfortable with power and who relied on it. A young attendant passed by and glanced at him again, her expression uncertain, then quickly looked away, choosing safety over curiosity. Marcus did not resent her. He had once been in positions where speaking up felt risky too. He lowered his phone, slid it back into his hand, and waited, aware that the longer this took, the more clearly the moment defined itself. He was not waiting to be allowed on a plane. He was waiting to see how far the assumptions would go before the truth became unavoidable. The verification did not move forward so much as it multiplied, questions stacking quietly on top of each other as Daniel Wright returned with a tablet held close to his chest, his tone measured but firm as he explained that the system was not immediately confirming the seat assignment, and that delays like this happened when records needed extra review. Marcus Ellison listened without interrupting, noting how the explanation shifted responsibility away from people and toward technology, as if the screen itself had raised an objection. Rebecca Holt stood slightly behind Daniel now, arms folded, scanning the boarding lane with an expression that suggested patience was wearing thin, not with the process but with Marcus himself. She mentioned policy again, emphasizing the need to ensure the comfort of other first-class passengers, her words carefully chosen, polite on the surface, edged underneath with implication. Marcus asked a simple question about timing, about how long verification usually took, and Daniel answered vaguely, saying it depended, that it could be a few minutes or longer, his eyes flicking toward the jet bridge as boarding continued without Marcus. Another passenger glanced back, curiosity turning to discomfort, then faced forward again, relieved that the spotlight was not on him. The bias did not announce itself with insults or raised voices. It revealed itself through hesitation, through the extra steps required of one person and not another, through the assumption that inconvenience was acceptable when directed at the right target. Marcus remained composed, though he felt the familiar tightening in his shoulders, the awareness that composure itself was being interpreted not as professionalism, but as resistance. Rebecca leaned in and suggested, almost casually, that Marcus might want to step further aside to avoid blocking the lane, even though he was already out of the way. The suggestion carried a quiet directive, a reminder of who was expected to yield. He took one measured step back, not because he was unsure, but because he understood how easily the narrative could shift if he appeared uncooperative. Daniel tapped the tablet. Again, frowned, and said the system still required confirmation, adding that security protocols sometimes flagged reservations for review. Marcus asked what triggered such a flag, and Daniel shrugged, saying it could be any number of things, travel patterns, Booking timing, internal audits. His answer broad enough to explain everything and nothing. Rebecca nodded in agreement, reinforcing the idea that the delay was routine, even as the clock above the gate crept closer to departure time. A young woman in business attire boarded smoothly, thanked by name as she passed, her first-class seat unquestioned. Marcus watched the contrast without comment. He knew the language of procedures well. His own company operated on them every day. He also knew how often procedures bent to accommodate comfort and how rarely they bent to protect dignity. The young attendant from earlier hovered nearby, her gaze moving between Marcus and the tablet, her lips parting slightly as if she might speak, then pressing together again when Rebecca glanced her way. Marcus caught the moment and stored it away, not as a grievance, but as evidence of how environments train people to stay quiet. Daniel finally looked up and suggested that if the issue could not be resolved quickly, they might need to reseat Marcus temporarily, assuring him it would only be for the duration of the flight. The word temporarily landed heavier than intended, a casual dismissal of inconvenience that would not be asked of others. Marcus inhaled slowly and exhaled, his voice steady as he said that reseating would not be necessary, that the seat assignment was correct. The pause that followed was subtle but telling, a silence in which authority weighed whether calm confidence would be allowed to stand. Around them, boarding continued, the plane filling row by row, the space Marcus was meant to occupy growing more distant with every passing minute. As the boarding lane thinned and the gate area grew quieter, a subtle shift occurred that did not announce itself with authority but with hesitation, the kind that belongs to someone noticing a detail that does not align. The young attendant Marcus had seen hovering earlier lingered near the counter, her name tag reading Emily Parker, her posture tense as she glanced between the tablet and the boarding screen mounted above. She had been trained to defer, to follow the lead of senior staff, yet something about the prolonged delay did not sit right with her. She stepped closer under the pretense of adjusting a stanchion and caught a glimpse of the reservation code on Daniel Wright's tablet. Recognizing the confirmation format she had learned during training, her eyes flicked up to the screen again, then back to Marcus, and for a moment their gazes met. Marcus did not nod or signal. He simply held her look calmly, offering no pressure, no plea. Emily swallowed and cleared her throat softly, speaking just loud enough for Daniel to hear that the system usually refreshed within seconds and that sometimes the offline cache caused a lag. Daniel acknowledged her comment without looking at her, saying he was handling it, his tone final. Rebecca Holt shifted her weight and gave Emily a brief glance that carried instruction without words. Emily stepped back, but the doubt remained. She moved to the adjacent terminal and logged in quickly, her fingers moving with quiet efficiency, checking the manifest from a different access point. The confirmation appeared immediately, clear and unambiguous. Seat 2A assigned, payment verified, status approved. Her chest tightened as she realized the delay had nothing to do with the system at all. She looked toward Rebecca and Daniel again, weighing the cost of speaking against the discomfort of staying silent. Around them, the last of the first-class passengers boarded, laughter drifting back from the jet bridge, the door agent announcing final calls for remaining groups. Time Preston. Emily took a small step forward and said, respectfully, that the reservation was showing as confirmed on her screen, that there might have been a sync issue earlier. Daniel finally turned to her, his expression controlled but edged with irritation, and said he did not need assistance, reminding her to focus on her assigned tasks. Rebecca added that they were following protocol and that conflicting information only complicated matters. The words were not harsh, but they carried weight. Emily felt her face warm as she nodded, retreating again, aware that pushing further could be seen as insubordination. Marcus observed the exchange quietly, recognizing the familiar pattern of truth acknowledged just enough to be dismissed. He felt no anger toward Emily. If anything, he respected the risk she had already taken. The gate area grew still, the hum replaced by the hollow quiet that comes just before doors close. Daniel announced that boarding would conclude shortly and suggested once more that Marcus consider alternative seating to avoid delaying departure. Marcus looked toward the aircraft, then back at Daniel, his expression unchanged. He did not repeat himself. He did not argue. He simply stood where he was, grounded in the certainty of what he knew. Emily hovered nearby, torn, her fingers tightening around a boarding pass stack as she watched the moment harden. She had seen enough to understand that this was no longer about efficiency. The witnesses in the gate area, few as they were, sensed it too, the air thickening with something unspoken. Marcus checked the time again, noting how close they were to the threshold where decisions become irreversible. He felt the weight of the space settle, not as defeat, but as anticipation, knowing that once assumptions are challenged, even quietly, they rarely retreat without consequence. The moment crossed a line not with a shout but with a decision, the kind made quietly and then defended as necessary. Daniel Wright leaned slightly toward the counter microphone and announced that final boarding for the flight would conclude immediately, his eyes sliding past Marcus as if he were already resolved. Rebecca Holt stepped forward and stated that since the verification could not be completed in time, the seat would be released to avoid delaying departure, her tone smooth, professional, and final. She reached for the keyboard, fingers poised to make the change official. Marcus felt the shift before it happened, the subtle downgrade of certainty into inconvenience, the assumption that his compliance was inevitable. He spoke once, evenly, saying that releasing the seat was not appropriate and that the reservation was valid, but Rebecca did not meet his eyes. Daniel added that he could rebook Marcus on a later flight or offer alternate seating if available, framing the outcome as assistance rather than removal. The language was careful, designed to sound reasonable to anyone listening without context. Emily Parker stiffened nearby, her mouth opening as if to object, then closing again when Rebecca glanced her way. The jet bridge door stood open, the last passengers already inside, the aircraft waiting. Marcus felt the familiar echo of another terminal, another time, years earlier when he had been younger and less insulated by success, standing at a counter with a letterhead that should have been enough and learning it was not. He remembered the heat of embarrassment, rising as people watched, the internal debate about whether dignity was worth missing a flight, the realization that silence was often mistaken for surrender. That memory did not weaken him now, it steadied him. He looked at the boarding screen as his name flickered and disappeared, replaced by standby text, the erasure happening in real time. Rebecca confirmed the change with a nod and said they would need Marcus to step aside so they could close the door. The phrasing implied obstruction, not exclusion. A man lingering nearby frowned and checked his phone, sensing the imbalance without fully understanding it. Emily took a small step forward and said, softly but clearly, that the seat should not have been released because the confirmation had been visible, her voice carrying just enough to be heard. Daniel turned to her sharply and reminded her that decisions were being made by supervisors, not trainees, the word landing heavier than intended. Emily flushed and stepped back, chastened. Marcus absorbed it all, the public demotion, the quiet correction, the institutional confidence that no meaningful consequence would follow. He did not raise his voice. He did not appeal to sympathy. He simply nodded once, acknowledging the choice they had made, and stepped back as requested, the gate area now unmistakably quiet. In that stillness, he felt a different memory surface, not of exclusion, but of the first time he had signed a contract large enough to change a company's trajectory, the weight of the pen, the understanding that leverage does not announce itself until it is used. He looked at his phone again, the screen reflecting the overhead lights, and recognized that the moment had clarified itself. This was no longer about boarding a plane. It was about how decisions are justified when they are aimed downward, and how quickly they unravel when aimed upward. Marcus unlocked the phone, his expression composed, his breathing steady, and placed the call, not in anger, but with the calm certainty of someone who knew exactly what the next minutes would cost everyone involved. Marcus Ellison held the phone to his ear as the ambient noise of the terminal faded into something distant and irrelevant, the call connecting almost immediately, as if the person on the other end had been expecting it. His voice was low and controlled, not hurried, not dramatic, simply precise as he confirmed his location and the situation without embellishment. He did not need to explain the significance of the flight or the inconvenience of the delay. Those details were assumed, understood within the shared language of business where timing and treatment both carried measurable value. As he listened, his gaze rested on the gate counter where Rebecca Holt and Daniel Wright finalized their departure checklist, confident now that the issue had been resolved in their favor. The aircraft door began to close, the hollow thud echoing softly through the jet bridge, sealing a decision that felt permanent to everyone watching. Marcus nodded once as the voice on the other end responded, asking a single clarifying question before shifting tone, the cadence changing from concern to action. He confirmed the contract reference number when prompted, the figure attached to it large enough to alter quarterly forecasts and long-term projections, and stated calmly that the terms would need immediate review due to conduct observed firsthand. There was no raised volume, no hint of threat, just a clear instruction delivered with authority that did not need reinforcement. Emily Parker stood a few feet away, pretending to organize paperwork while listening despite herself, her heart pounding as she realized the conversation was not about a missed flight, but about consequences far beyond the terminal. Marcus thanked the person on the line and ended the call, slipping the phone back into his hand without any outward sign of satisfaction. He remained still for a moment, allowing the reality of the choice to settle, aware that leverage once applied could not be withdrawn without cost. Daniel glanced over then, noticing the phone, noticing the stillness, a flicker of uncertainty passing across his face before he dismissed it and turned back to his screen. Rebecca smiled politely at another agent and confirmed that the gate was clear, her confidence unshaken, unaware that the framework supporting it had already begun to shift. Marcus took a step toward the seating area, not to wait for another flight, but to give the process time to unfold as it would. He reflected briefly on how often power reveals itself only after dignity has been tested, how systems rely on the assumption that those affected lack the means or will to respond. Around him, the terminal resumed its rhythm, announcements calling passengers to distant gates, wheels rolling, conversations overlapping. To anyone observing casually, the moment had passed, reduced to a minor inconvenience resolved by schedule and policy. Yet beneath that surface, messages were being sent, meetings were being interrupted, and decisions were being reconsidered with new urgency. Emily finally looked up at Marcus, her expression a mix of apology and awe, but he did not seek her acknowledgement. He knew that what mattered now was not recognition, but accountability. He checked the time once more, calculating how long it would take for the effects of a single call to reach the people who believed this encounter would end quietly. Marcus sat down, placing his bag at his feet, posture relaxed, eyes forward, embodying the calm that comes from certainty. The phone rested in his hand, screen dark, the work already in motion, as the terminal lights reflected off the polished floor and the space around him returned to normal, unaware that the balance had already shifted. The first sign that something had shifted came not with an announcement, but with a pause, the kind that feels heavier than noise. Daniel Wright's tablet chimed softly, an incoming message cutting through his routine as he glanced down and frowned, scrolling once, then again, his posture tightening in a way Marcus Ellison recognized immediately. Rebecca Holt noticed it too, the rhythm of her movements faltering as she leaned closer, her polite expression dimming as she read over Daniel's shoulder. The gate computer refreshed, then refreshed again, a new alert flashing briefly before disappearing, leaving behind a silence that no longer felt procedural. Daniel cleared his throat and looked around the gate area as if searching for context, his eyes landing on Marcus for the first time not as an obstacle, but as a variable he had miscalculated. Rebecca asked him quietly what the message meant, and Daniel answered just as quietly, his voice stripped of its earlier certainty, saying that corporate operations was requesting immediate clarification regarding a partner incident tied to this flight. The word partner lingered, vague but loaded. Emily Parker froze where she stood, paperwork forgotten, her attention fixed on the exchange as understanding began to dawn. Daniel straightened and approached Marcus with a different energy than before, his tone suddenly careful, asking if there might have been a misunderstanding and whether Marcus could spare a moment to discuss the situation. Marcus rose smoothly, his expression unchanged, and asked what clarification was needed. Rebecca interjected that they were only following protocol earlier and that no offense had been intended, her words arriving late and landing softly against the hard surface of what had already occurred. Marcus listened without interrupting, then responded evenly that intent was not the issue, that actions were. He stated his name clearly when asked, Marcus Ellison, and watched as Daniel's face shifted again, recognition flickering as the name connected to the message on his screen. Daniel's shoulders squared instinctively, and he asked for confirmation, his voice dropping, asking if Marcus Ellison was affiliated with Ellison Dynamics. Marcus nodded once, not with pride, not with triumph, but with simple accuracy. The air around the gate seemed to compress as Rebecca's breath caught, and she looked back toward the counter, replaying the last half hour in her mind. Daniel glanced at his tablet again, then back at Marcus, and said that corporate leadership was requesting a call immediately regarding the aviation services agreement, his phrasing careful, almost deferential. Marcus replied that the call had already been made and that the agreement in question was under active review due to conduct observed on site. He did not raise his voice. He did not enumerate grievances. He allowed the truth to exist plainly between them. Emily felt a chill as the implication settled, the realization that the man they had sidelined was the same executive whose company represented a substantial portion of the airline's enterprise revenue. Rebecca attempted a conciliatory smile and said that if Marcus would like to board now, they could reopen the door, her offer framed as a correction rather than an apology. Marcus looked toward the jet bridge, then back at her, and said calmly that boarding was no longer the priority. He stated that the concern was how decisions were made when no one believed accountability would follow. Daniel swallowed and nodded, his authority visibly eroding as the imbalance revealed itself. Nearby passengers sensed the shift without understanding its source, watching as the tone at the gate transformed. Marcus gathered his bag and thanked Emily quietly for checking the system earlier, acknowledging her integrity without spectacle. He then turned back to Daniel and Rebecca and said one sentence, measured and precise, that landed with finality, that a billion-dollar partnership depended not just on contracts but on conduct, and that today had clarified the company's position. The words did not echo, they did not need to, because the silence that followed said everything. The collapse unfolded with a quiet efficiency that contrasted sharply with the confidence that had filled the gate minutes earlier, messages cascading through internal channels faster than anyone on the floor could fully grasp. Daniel Wright's tablet continued to light up with notifications, each one tightening his jaw as directives arrived from departments far removed from Gate C-17, yet suddenly very present. Rebecca Holt stepped back behind the counter, her posture rigid as she answered a call with a strained professionalism, nodding repeatedly as if agreement alone might soften what she was hearing. Words like escalation, review, and suspension surfaced in clipped fragments before she lowered the phone, her earlier assurance replaced by calculation. The departure screen refreshed again, this time showing operational notes that drew the attention of nearby staff, murmurs rippling outward as the reality of corporate scrutiny became undeniable. Emily Parker watched the transformation with a mix of disbelief and gravity, the environment recalibrating around a truth that could no longer be contained. Daniel approached Marcus Ellison once more, his voice subdued now, explaining that senior leadership was requesting a detailed incident report and that the partnership review had triggered immediate internal protocols. Marcus acknowledged the information with a nod, neither surprised nor vindictive, understanding that systems respond decisively only when leverage forces clarity. Rebecca attempted to frame the situation as a misunderstanding exacerbated by timing, emphasizing their commitment to service values, but the words sounded thin against the weight of consequences already in motion. Marcus responded evenly that values reveal themselves under pressure and that today had been instructive. Around them, agents exchanged glances, the certainty of hierarchy giving way to apprehension as the implications spread. A supervisor from another gate arrived, summoned by urgent messages, and listened quietly as Daniel explained, his voice careful, choosing each word with the awareness that documentation had already begun elsewhere. The supervisor looked from Daniel to Rebecca to Marcus, piecing together the scene with growing unease, then excused himself to make another call. Boarding announcements resumed at distant gates, but the area around C-17 felt suspended, as if time had narrowed to the consequences of a single choice. Marcus gathered his belongings without haste, aware that the practical effects were now beyond the reach of any individual at the counter. He observed how quickly authority recalibrated, how tone softened when accountability appeared, and how apologies emerged only after stakes became visible. Emily felt a strange steadiness settle in her chest, the knowledge that speaking up had mattered even if it had not changed the immediate outcome. Daniel's shoulders sagged slightly as he absorbed a directive instructing him to submit a statement and remain available, the finality of corporate language stripping away any illusion of control. Rebecca stared at the screen, her reflection faint in the glass, confronting the realization that protocol offered no shelter once behavior was examined at scale. Marcus paused briefly, meeting Daniel's eyes, and stated calmly that the partnership cancellation would be communicated formally, that legal teams would handle the details, and that the decision was not impulsive but corrective. The words landed with a measured weight, not as punishment, but as consequence. He turned and walked toward the terminal seating area, blending once more into the flow of travelers, leaving behind a gate irrevocably altered. Behind him, the machinery of response continued to grind forward, contracts reevaluated, leadership alerted, reputations reassessed, all set in motion by a moment when assumptions were allowed to stand unchallenged. The collapse was not dramatic, but it was complete, unfolding exactly as systems do when the cost of bias finally exceeds the comfort of denial. Marcus Ellison sat quietly near the wide, terminal windows as the afternoon light stretched across the floor, planes taxiing in the distance with mechanical indifference to the moment that had just passed. The gate behind him no longer held his attention, its urgency spent, its authority recalibrated elsewhere. He watched travelers move through the space, each carrying destinations and assumptions, and reflected on how easily dignity becomes conditional when people believe no one important is watching. His phone vibrated once with a brief confirmation, the formal notice that the partnership review had escalated to termination, effective immediately, a decision now documented, scheduled, and irreversible. Marcus read it without emotion and locked the screen, knowing that impact did not require reaction. Emily Parker passed by hesitantly, slowing just enough to offer a quiet apology on behalf of what had happened, her voice sincere and unguarded. Marcus thanked her for speaking up when it mattered, reminding her that integrity does not always change outcomes immediately, but it always shapes them eventually. She nodded, visibly steadier, and continued on, carrying with her a lesson few training manuals ever teach. Marcus gathered his bag and stood, not in a rush, not burdened by delay, but anchored in the clarity that followed resolution. He considered how often people mistake calm for compliance, how silence is interpreted as acceptance, and how systems rely on those misunderstandings to persist. Today had disrupted that expectation without spectacle, without anger, through the simple insistence that standards apply universally, or they fail entirely. He moved toward the exit, passing the gate where Daniel Wright and Rebecca Holt remained occupied with new instructions, their earlier certainty replaced by careful restraint. Marcus did not look back. He did not need to. The consequences were no longer personal. They belonged to the institution now. Outside, the terminal air felt cooler, less compressed, the noise dispersing into something manageable. Marcus stepped into the flow of the airport, indistinguishable once more from the crowd, and found a quiet satisfaction not in the outcome itself, but in the principle it reinforced. Power, he knew, was not proven by how loudly it is asserted, but by how consistently it is applied. He thought of younger versions of himself who had endured moments like this without leverage, who had been told implicitly and explicitly that belonging was conditional. He carried them forward now, not as resentment, but as responsibility. The flight he had missed would depart without him, schedules adjusting as they always do, yet the shift set in motion would travel far beyond any runway. Marcus paused briefly near the exit doors, taking one last look at the controlled chaos of departures and arrivals, and allowed himself a single reflection that settled everything into place. He had not raised his voice. He had not demanded recognition. He had simply raised the standard, and in doing so, reminded a system that respect is not a courtesy extended at discretion but a requirement that defines legitimacy. With that, he stepped outside, the automatic doors closing softly behind him, leaving the terminal to absorb the lesson long after he was gone.